Welcome back to another Tips and Tricks Thursday. My name is Derek, and today we're going to be going over tips and tricks on how to properly reball the sandwich layer on an iPhone. Let's get into the video. Now, the phone that we're going to be working on today is an iPhone 13 Pro Max, and it doesn't have service. It does receive Wi-Fi, but it's not picking up on service. In fact, when you go to check for the IMEI, all we get is the serial number, which means it's not communicating with either the bottom board or the baseband. Now, over half of the cases where you lose service, it's something as simple as fixing something with the sandwich board. Sometimes it's pulled pads, and then there is the rare occasion where the actual baseband IC itself shorts out and could be causing that issue. There's a ton to cover in this video, so let's first start by opening up the phone. Alright, so the first thing that we'll do is we'll go ahead and turn this guy off. We'll take out our two pentalobe screws, and now we can stick it inside of the TPK. Now, if you haven't already, swap out the smaller circular one for the bigger square one, these suction cups. Alright, we'll tighten down the sides. We'll turn it on and we'll lower it down. Alright, so we'll go ahead and start to lift. Add a few drops of isopropyl alcohol on the frame here. There we got that nice little pop. And we'll lift it out of there. Alright, and then we can separate gently the top and fold it out. Looks like I'm the first one in here. There's no fingerprints or anything. Alright, so let's do basically a full teardown so we can get the board out without issue. Alright, so we've got the board out. You need to take out, in order to do that, you need to take out the battery, the cameras. You can even take out the components at the top if you really want to, but you have to at least get the battery out and the camera. The camera's kind of in the way and it's easy to remove. So, next thing we're going to do is remove a couple of these things that will melt or shrivel. I'm going to take off all of the foam padding using some isopropyl alcohol, and then we'll gently get under and peel them up. And in doing so, we'll be able to save them and put them back on, just like that. And now for the big one. And then on the back, we've got a sticker that we're going to also peel up. Just get under one of its corners, and then we'll carefully peel it off as well. Now, looking at the motherboard from the side, there is a very small gap that I can see here and there. It's a little wider than I want to be, so most likely we do have pulled pads in this scenario, but we won't know until we get to that point if we have to. We're going to remove all of the black stickers here on the border, and then I'm going to take some flux, just a little bit of flux, and we're going to try to compress it down into the sandwich layer, this gap right here between the brown and the gold, all the way around as much as we can. Very small amount though, just enough to kind of smear it into that crack, just like that. A very small amount along the border, kind of smushed into it. You can take your finger and you kind of, like this, it'll compress it into there. All right, next we're going to take our 13 series heat plate and we'll line it up there so that it's in the right spot. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to let this heat up. And what we're looking for is for this to get up above 170. And what we'll start to see at that point is some movement in the motherboard. All right, so what I'm looking for is some movement in this top board by just agitating it a little bit. As soon as we see that, we can basically let it start to cool back down, and then we'll be good to go. And test it to see if that's all it was needed. As soon as we have movement, that means that all of the solder all the way around the perimeter has liquefied, and that would be the point to lift it if we have to come back and do it again. So we're basically up at the temperature where I'd normally start to see movement. So hopefully soon we'll start to see some movement. I'm not nudging it a lot. It'll barely move if I nudge it. But I'll be able to notice it by the way it feels and just by looking. Alright, we're at the max temperature I have it set to. Now we'll turn it off and we'll let it cool down. I'm going to let it cool down with the fan. Alright, so yep, it's now cool to the touch. So let's reinstall it and check and see if it registers more than just a serial number. Alright, so now we just need to connect up the battery and let's power it on and see what happens. Alright, there's the Apple logo. A moment of truth. Still just a serial number. Okay, so this is one where we have to split it. All right, so we'll go ahead and power it off. We'll disconnect the screen and the battery, and we'll take it apart. Now this is it was totally worth all of that time spent, because a good portion of the time that's all you have to do. Okay. All right, so for this next part, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and put it back on here. If you don't already have this, I'd recommend getting this 2-layered motherboard separator assistant pen. Comes with 2 different kinds, a kind for Android or Samsung, and then one for phone or iPhone. And what I'm going to do is we'll put it in the middle on one of the pillars here. Screw down all the way. Go ahead and turn this back on and let it heat up, and we'll get to splitting these boards. To assist in this, I've got one of the tools that I use to lift up ICs, such as CPU, NAND. It's really flat on the end, and it'll help get in between the layers and kind of give some leverage to help kind of separate the grab that it'll have. This is like a surface tension that you almost have to break once it's at temperature to lift it out. And once it's there, we'll split it here. We'll split it on the other side, and then we'll be able to lift up using the pen here. So we're almost to temperature. I'll let the tool also get nice and warm so it doesn't create any cold spots. When I slide it in, it doesn't draw away any heat. Not that there's much thermal mass behind it anyway. All right, we are almost to temperature, so I'm going to start putting this in the corner there, and we'll see if it wants to split. All right, we're almost up to temperature, and I'm not looking to rush this. I just want to see real good movement on all sides. That's good movement. That's good movement. And it came off. We'll turn it off, and we'll get out our fan and let it cool down a little bit. Hi, let me talk to you a little bit about what you're seeing here. What I'm going to be doing is going around the border, going over all of the pads and covering them in a lower melting solder. I'm going to be using a 138, and that's going to help bring down the temperature so that it's going to be easier for me to wick them. Now as I'm doing this, I'm sadly removing the spacers. Now the spacers are there to help when Apple assembles it, to compress it, to get a nice solid joint. And unfortunately, when you're reballing it, you remove those, which means you no longer can have that compression. You literally just have to let the surface tension put it back together when the time comes. But I'm going to be adding that low melt flux and going around with wick to wick it off. And I need to do this both on the top and the bottom board. It's quite satisfying, so enjoy it. Next, I'm going to be taking a stencil so that I can line it up with all of these solder pads and put on some solder paste. I'm going to be using a 148 solder paste, which is kind of the solder that was used for the iPhone 10 series. This will allow me to bring the temperature I need to get the heat plate to down just a little bit less than the 210. I'll be able to bring it down to probably 180 or something like that to be able to get it to melt. And one of the tips that I have for you is to dry out your solder paste. Something like a clean room wipe, even a paper towel, to be able to kind of smear the paste into that and then scrape back up what's remaining. It kind of removes some of the flux, making it a little easier to go into the stencil and also deposit down on the board. Now I have 2 different methods depending on what I'm looking at for reballing. I either do it with the stencil on, or I remove the stencil after smearing the paste in, and I flow the balls that way. Both ways work. The only issue is when you use the stencil, you tend to have warpage with heat, and that can cause for an interesting, to say the least, solder job. If you're careful and you go around nice and slowly and you distribute the heat properly, you can pretty much It's quite easy to do with the stencil, but if you can pull the stencil up cleanly, it's much easier to flow the solder paste without a stencil. You can do this either with a heat gun, or you can put it back on the heating platform, and when it heats up, the solder will all congeal together into solder balls, and you won't have any bridging and things like that. So you can do it both ways. Let me know in the comments below which one you prefer. Now in this case, I did find that as I lifted the stencil, I had a couple that I knew were not going to have enough solder, so I did carefully put it back. Luckily, I didn't remove it all the way so I could keep it in alignment. And then I'll go around and carefully flow each one. There is the occasion where you have to fix either one that's missing some solder or one where it does bridge together. As you can see, I have to do that in a couple spots. It's not a big deal. You just have to take your time to make sure each one is nice and even. You don't want any that are taller or shorter than their neighbors. Now, one thing I should have done right after taking this apart was test the baseband to see if there's any issues with it. And as you can probably tell, I'm foreshadowing a bit here, there's definitely an issue. That being said, let me show you how I diagnose it, and at least you'll get an idea how to remove an IC like this that has an underfill, how to reball it, and put it back. Alright, so with the multimeter, I'm going to come in and do a couple tests around. Looks like we've got seems like a partial short here. This is ground. This isn't supposed to be. This is supposed to read 0.36, and that's reading 30.6, so it's way off. Let's see. Yeah, this is all connected. And this is a secondary line that's different, and it's reading 0.06, and it should be reading 0.3, so it's way off as well. So chances are either something's going on under this IC or it's shorted out internally. And unfortunately, if it is shorted out internally, there's nothing that I can do because this isn't a replaceable one. So the only thing I can do really at this point is pull this chip, reball it, test onto the pads just to see if there's anything else going on there. And then we can reinstall it and see if that fixes it. Otherwise, this phone is like an iPod. No service, just Wi-Fi. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go around the perimeter with a lower heat, probably around 250, so that I can heat up and scrape the underfill. Now you want a small tool to do this. You obviously don't want to damage the board, but you want to be able to get in between the components that are attached to that underfill so that when you go to pop the chip off, they don't come with it. In this case, there's a capacitor that's going to get in the way, so I'm going to move it off to the side from the corner that I want to pry on. Once you're up to temperature on this IC, you'll be able to pop it off, and you can do this pretty cleanly as long as it's up to temperature. If it's not up to temperature and you try to pop it off, you can damage it. And if you damage it, it's kind of game over. And or you'll pull the pads on the board, and although that's not game over, it's still not fun because that means you're going to have to do a lot more work because the Wi-Fi is also paired on the bottom board. So a couple things you'll need to know. You'll need to remove all of the underfill, not only on the IC, but on the board. And you'll want to go around the perimeter because that's where it piles up the most. And you want to make sure that you remove all of it. Otherwise, when the chip goes to sink back down, it might use that as a lever and it won't have the ability to go all the way down and suck to the board and pancake out the solder like it should. And if you have any pads that are no longer a circle, you will want to take the time to UV mask them off so that the solder doesn't potentially bridge over from a ground plane to a data line or cross two data lines. Reballing is quite simple. You want to choose the solder of your choice. I'm going to use a 183 because this is a bigger chip and I also don't want it to move a lot, especially when I go back to the platform. It is a little harder to work with. You could go down to a 138 and that would be totally acceptable. It's a lot easier to work with, a lot easier to flow. But when it comes to the bigger ICs like Wi-Fi, NAND, CPU, I like to use either a 183 or even a 217. It all depends on what my goal is. Is it data recovery or is it function? And sometimes reballing, you have to do it more than once. Another tip that I have for you, as you can see, I have to go in at a second. As you see, I have to go in a second time to reball this one. And that's because I decided to not use a little trick that I have, which is to use a paper towel where you kind of roll it up on both sides so that your stencil doesn't warp when you go to put pressure on it, so that it stays flat. So you get that thickness of the paper towel folded up a couple times to help keep the stencil flat when you put pressure on it. And that's what I do the second time, and it goes a lot smoother. If you ever have too much solder because somehow it was uneven, you take your time to use a razor blade and scrape off the tops of those, and that way you can get it much closer to even solder across the IC. We'll want to add flux to both the IC using some heat and spreading it out nice and evenly. And also when it comes to and also on the board, we'll want to make sure we add a very thin layer of flux so that nothing oxidizes when we get it up to temperature. That'll leave you with a cold joint and it won't work. Now I did take the time. Now you might have seen that I took the time to test the IC itself, checking the line that was shorted on the chip side. And in fact, the chip did have a short, which means at this point, it's a long shot that it's going to work. It won't work, but we're going to be putting it back together anyway. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. Now let's continue with the repair. Alright, so we've got this all reballed. We'll go ahead and stick it back on here. And we've got the top all ready to go as well. So we'll line it on up. And now we just got to make sure it's perfectly squared up before we turn it on. That way we won't have to make many adjustments when it's time to watch it settle. Alright, I really like the alignment, so we're going to go ahead and turn it on. And I'm actually going to lower the temperature to 180 because we've lowered the temperature of the mid-frame solder, so we won't need to get all the way up to over 200 this time to put it back together. So we'll let this heat up and we should be good to go. Now because we don't have any spacers, I can't put these on there. It would compress it too much. We'd get squeezed out and we'd get bridging a bunch of stuff. So we're going to just let the natural surface tension of the solder melting join the top and the bottom together. What we'll actually be able to see is it physically close up when it gets up to temperature. That little gap, we'll see it close up, and we'll see that close up all the way around. All right, we're where I want to be temperature wise. I'm just going to give it a little tap. You can almost see it want to snap back into place just like an IC would. And I'm going to turn it off and let it cool down. I'm going to use a fan to help cool things down. Alright, so let's take a look at installing it back inside the phone. Alright, got the board in. Go ahead and connect up the 5G antenna here. We'll leave the cameras out for now, but we'll go ahead and connect up the display and the procs, and then we'll connect the battery. Alright, we'll go ahead and turn it on. Alright, let's try to turn it on. Here we've got our Apple logo. Alright, so we still recognize Wi-Fi. And when we go to regulatory, we're still on this. Which means the baseband, in this case, is shorted out itself. And that's why we're not able to get past it. So that's unfortunate. Alright, so as you can see, this phone definitely had an issue with the baseband. And unfortunately, that is a paired component, which means just like the CPU or the NAND, there's not much we can do about restoring this phone to its fullest capacity. There are typically ways to read the baseband EEPROM and reprogram it with a programmer. I don't have one, and I don't think I've ever done it on a 13 Pro Max either, and there might be a reason for that. That being said, I hope you're able to take some of my tips and tricks on how to reball a sandwich board so that you can have an easier time doing it yourself. Thanks a ton for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow for another Phone Fix Friday.